This is Mendix Best Practices with Nolan Ramsey. I'm going to cover some backlog grooming best practices today and build upon some other items that we've spoken about in the past. So I'm going to show the backlog here in the Sprintr, the Mendix Sprintr. And what I wanted to cover today was what is it that you're doing in a backlog grooming session? In reality, if you've done a good job in preparing your stories, and I've got some other videos that you can look at for that, you should have a great idea of exactly what it is in that story that you're supposed to be doing. In a true backlog grooming, you wouldn't have these labels assigned. That's from a previous video, so I'll get rid of them. But what's important is what is the story that needs to be done? What is the description of that story? And then ultimately, and I'm going to go into the details here because that's a little bit better view of doing this. What are the comments? Because the comments should tell you what the definition of done is for a specific story. I'm going to re-edit this one and put a definition of done that says a line manager only should log on and see their employees and the PTO they are taking for the next 30 days. Okay, so I'll post that comment. And this is my definition of done. This is what you have done, hopefully, at the beginning or during the creation of a story or during your backlog grooming. You might not have gotten to that. Sometimes you're brainstorming in your backlog or you're getting feedback and you're promoting it to a backlog story. And you don't have a lot of context. You don't have a lot of definition around what that is. So the whole point of the backlog grooming is to flesh that out so that the team can assign story points based upon how the team perceives the effort of work. So let's talk about the definition of done real quick. You have determined that what the story is. Maybe you've gotten this and said, as a manager, I want to see employees and their PTOs on my homepage so I can determine who is available for work, I'm assuming. They did say this is strictly for line managers, only voluntary PO. And the definition of done went a little bit further. It's what we did in the backlog grooming. We asked the person who submitted it for some follow-up, maybe previously an email, maybe they're at the meeting as a stakeholder, and we find out that they said, well, when I was thinking of this, it's just for line managers, like I said. It's only voluntary PTO. I don't care about administrative leave or involuntary things. But I need to know when I log on, right then and there, I should see the list of my employees and I should see the PTO voluntary that they're taking for the next 30 days. That's the view that I'm envisioning. So that would tell your designers what they need to know to deliver a good design for this. It would also tell the developers the complexity. Okay, well, I need to think about line managers, so I need to have a restriction, maybe an entity constraint. Maybe I do it through workflow, do through a data retrieve. I only need to see voluntary PTO, so I need to make sure that the data separates the PTO by voluntary and involuntary. Maybe it doesn't do that today. I need to build that feature out. That's a little bit more complex. Let's think about that. And then they only need it for the next 30 days, so it's time bound. So I need to make sure I constrain the data of this particular view by 30 days. That's definitely not a database constraint. That's going to be something that's more of a workflow constraint, because what if I want to change that? So I might ask a question in the backlog grooming session as a developer and say, well, how static is this 30-day number? And if they say it's always 30 days, that's all I'll ever want. Okay, that tells me I can build that 30-day restriction in the code. More often than not, when you see anything that's a numeric time bound, I will tell you from experience, best practice, that the people that are saying that typically want this to be variable. They want to be able to adjust that. So you need to think about that into your estimate. I probably need to have a screen, some sort of administrative screen, where this number n can be set. We live in a world of algorithms, right? So let's build it that way. Okay, that adds a little bit more complexity maybe to the story. So maybe I bump up the story point value of this thing just a little bit, but it's going to be a better feature overall. And if they are agreeable and they're like, yes, you're right, this could change to 45 days or 60 days or whatever I want it to be. Okay, we'll make those concessions. So once you've had the dialogue in the backlog grooming about this session, okay, now you can go into the edit and it's time to pick the points. So what does this point value really mean? It's kind of like a Fibonacci sequence. you notice that it's not just a pure Fibonacci sequence, but you can kind of get the idea, right? And there's some different ways to approach this. Every team is going to be different. So one team might say this story is a 3-point story. The next team might say it's a 1-point story. The next team might say it's a 40-point. None of them are wrong. They're all accurate. It depends on that specific team, because the point in time that they assess this at isn't what's important. It's the velocity of completing these stories, each sprint, over time that matters. It's the backlog and how they manage this backlog of information. So if they take all of the information into account and the definition of done of what needs to be developed, and you've had the dialogue, the team should vote. And if you've got multiple developers, they get a vote. If there's design elements of it, they get a vote. Anybody who would be involved in this particular story, testers, right? They get a vote to say, how complex do you think this is? And what I usually give as guidance is a 1-point story means that I could do it right now in about 5 minutes. That's my general rule of thumb. It's very simple. Now that 5 minutes might be in an hour, right? The time is not as important. It's important. It's not as important as how difficult is it? If I know exactly what I need to do, and I know where to go in the tools to make that happen, and it's very simple, then that's the easiest a story will ever be. That's a 1-point story. A 3-point story is literally somewhere in the neighborhood of roughly 3 times harder. So if the 1-point story, if it's 5 minutes, does that mean a 3-point is 15? Maybe it does for you. That would be a bit excessive to me. I usually think in terms of hours. So, even if it's a 5-minute job, I'm going to do 1 point. I think of it as an hour. 3 points doesn't mean 3 hours. That could mean a day to me. Like when I bid out stories, typically somewhere in the neighborhood of 5 to 8 points is a day. 2 to 3 is a half day, a little bit more complex than a 1-pointer that's, no time at all. A 13-point story means it's going to take me a couple of days. That could be 2, could be 3, could be 4. But it's going to take me a few days to figure this particular story out. It's more complex. It's got more moving pieces. 20 is about the limit, though, I'll just say that, of any story point evaluation that we use. Because 20 point means, okay, that's going to take me a few days to build that particular story. Anything longer than that, and I start to question, is it really a fully fleshed out story, or is it an epic? And there's a term that we use in Agile and Scrum about epics versus stories. Epics are sort of feature concepts. Stories are individual requirements, more tech spec if you think about it like that. That's not a pure analogy, but take it for what it is. 40 points and 100 points is more in the epic size. That tells me I probably need to break the story down into smaller chunks. I don't really want to have to sign up a resource and give them one story to work on for an entire week or two, a sprint, in other words. That's not really efficient use of their time. Because what happens if they unexpectedly need to go on vacation? Then I've got this big chunk of work that's maybe only halfway completed, and I can't do anything about it until they get back because I don't know what context they finished, etc. So let's break those down a little bit. I usually want my stories to be 20 points or less. That's the best practice that we typically use, and that's the concept of how we do the point values. So I hope this is useful about what we're doing in a backlog grooming session. Figuring out the points, the final step should be, and the most important piece is moving this story up or down based upon ranking, so that when you do your project build, your sprint build, that you are working from the top down. And you can adjust these as the project rolls along. The product owner should be doing that, should be logging in and moving these different values up and down, depending upon how complex or the urgency and the impact is what I like to use, the UI, right? Urgency and impact of a story, and move them up and down the backlog. And then we work off the top to build the different sprints. Okay. I hope this was helpful and helped you understand a little bit more about backlog grooming, what it is that we're really talking about with backlog grooming, and how we put this into practice using the Mendix Sprintr. Thanks.